Okay, I'd like to dedicate today's shir to Dobra Levitt, whose yahrzeit was a few days ago. This was her second yahrzeit. She was someone who was on her own. She arrived from America in her retirement years already, and she lived in Gilo, and she had no family, I would say, really to speak of either in America or in Israel. But for a couple of years or so, she was a regular at the Talmud and Technicolor shir when we were on site, and she used to be a very eager attendee. And unfortunately, she died suddenly at home. Her neighbor discovered her, and the only thing he knew about her was an association with Beit Knesset HaNasi. She had no other communal attachments. She was a sort of amateur poet and writer, but she had no communal attachments. So the neighbor thought she was a member of Hanasi, and asked whether we would man the funeral. Essentially, there would be no one at the funeral other than the Chevra Kadisha and Zaka. So we put together a minyan on that very same day that we were notified a couple of years ago. And she had a mechubad funeral, and Kaddish was said for her as well. So that was Dobra Levitt. So Alea HaShalom. I wanted to dedicate this shir to her, as she has no relatives, and she was a very fine woman. Okay, let me start by doing a resume of last week's shir, which was an important one because we discussed the whole issue of making a bracha in advance of a mitzvah, what the Gemara referred to as making a bracha over la'asiyasam. In advance of doing the mitzvah, the bracha is made as a introductory statement prior to the mitzvah, not to be said during the mitzvah, not to be said after the mitzvah, but before. And that having been established, there was a tostos we did together, which is very important, which asked the question how we can apply this to the netilat lulav. When we take a lulav and we want to make a bracha on it, it seems that we're in a catch-22 situation. Whatever we do doesn't seem to work if we try to make the bracha in advance of the mitzvah. Because according to the Talmud, as soon as you pick up the lulav and arba minim, you're already yotzei your mitzvah. It says, you should take. So the mere taking into hand is already a fulfillment of a mitzvah, even if you do nothing else. So what should you do to make your bracha in advance? If you make the bracha while it's still on the table, you have a lulav and esrog on the table in front of you, you make a bracha before picking it up, because that will be in advance of fulfilling the mitzvah. Tosfos says that doesn't work because there's a Gemara elsewhere that says that the mitzvah, the object of the mitzvah, has already to be at hand, literally in your hand, if you like, when you make the bracha. And if it's still in a box or on the table, then it's not at hand, and therefore it's too early to make a bracha. Of course, once you've picked it up, it's too late to make a bracha. So therefore, Tosfos gave three suggestions. One was that you pick up, just shall we say, the lulav, and you leave a esrog on the table. At that point, you already have part of the mitzvah in your hand. You may then make the bracha because it's already in your hand. However, there's no fulfillment of the mitzvah because you really need to hold the esrog as well. So you pick up the lulav, make a bracha, and then you pick up the esrog. And in that situation, the bracha will have been made in advance of the fulfillment of the mitzvah, because the fulfillment is only in at the moment you pick up the esrog after the bracha. That was option one. Tosfos gave an option two, which is the option that we actually make use of today, which is to pick up the arba minim, but as we do so, to have the esrog inverted so that the pitum is facing downwards. Equally well, we could pick up the lulav upside down, but it's a very awkward thing to pick up upside down. So we pick the esrog up upside down. You only fulfill the mitzvah when the species are in the pointing in the correct direction. So at that moment, when you picked up your lulav and your esrog, there is no fulfillment of the mitzvah because one of these species isn't facing the right way. However, since they're now in your hand, you're at the position where you can now make a bracha. So you make a bracha, and then you turn over the esrog so that the pitum is facing upwards and everything works nicely. You made the bracha in advance the fulfillment of the mitzvah. Tosfos actually gave us a third option, which is one which is a bit more tricky, but certainly an alternative as well, which is to pick up the two species the correct way round, but to avoid the fulfillment of the mitzvah by having a negative kavanah. You have a kavanah, in other words, in your mind, when you pick them up, you have an intent that until after you've made the bracha, you do not wish to be yotzer, you do not wish to fulfill the mitzvah. So even though in effect you're picking up the two species the correct way around, your state of mind prevents the fulfillment of the mitzvah. The moment you've made the bracha, then your mind is now free to allow the mitzvah to take effect. In other words, you say, now I want the mitzvah to take effect. And that works as well. Even though Tosfos says there is a general klal that mitzvahs einon tzrichos kavanos, that most mitzvot don't need a kavanah. In other words, you don't have to have a positive intent when you do the mitzvah to do the mitzvah. You can, to a certain extent, daydream your way through a mitzvah and still fulfill it. Nevertheless, if a person has a definitive negative intention, that will always prevent the fulfillment of the mitzvah. So as long as you negatively intend to do the mitzvah, then you're not doing the mitzvah, even if everything's at hand and pointing in the right way. So that's another possibility. Pick it up the right, but you have to have that negative intent just before you pick up the esrog, because if you hold the nun of an esrog for a second, then essentially you've already fulfilled your mitzvah. You know, it's certainly midivrei Torah, obviously it's not being fulfilled in the best possible way to do so just for a second, but any amount of any period of time during which you haven't got a negative intent means that you will fulfill the mitzvah. So you have to have this negative intent just before you pick up and all the way through until you've made the bracha. And then you can release that negative intent. So the mind, in that sense, can define when the mitzvah is carried out, and that's option 3. So those are the 3 options. As I say, we normally rely on option 2, the inversion of the esrog before the bracha is made, and then correcting the position of the esrog after the bracha is made. That's normally the way in which we fulfill the mitzvah and do the bracha in the right sequence.
Just one question: is it from Tosfos that we do it?
Tosfos gives us this eitzah and these eitzot, yes.
Is that where it comes from, that we do it?
Yes, because the Gemara, it's clear from the Gemara that you have a problem in making a bracha, that you actually yotzer it straight away, but the details don't come through in the Gemara in the same ways they come through Tosfot. A lot of our halachot come through the Rishonim. In other words, the detailed performance come through the Rishonim, not all from the page of the Talmud. We just had a page of the Talmud. Our Shulchan Aruch would not be in fit state. You remember the Shulchan Aruch is essentially built up by a democratic count of the opinions where there are machlokas between 3 of the major Rishonim. So they're the starting point, really. Their opinions on the interpretation of the Gemara are really the starting point for setting the Shulchan Aruch that we have today. We then, we did a little bit of Darshanot and Psukim. We went on to the Mishnah. We're going to go back to that Mishnah now and repeat that so that we can take ourselves further, because we need to be in the Inyan of the Mishnah and the first part of the Gemara to be able to take it further. But this is the Mishnah on Lamed Tes Amud Aleph 39a, 2/3 of the way down, 3/4 of the way down the page. And the Mishnah starts there. Obviously, there's this Mem Saf Nun Yud in great big capital bold print, and then Halokech Lulav Mechavero B'Shvius. And we're going to restart that Mishnah. And this Mishnah was dealing peripherally, really, with Lulav and Esrog. But the main thrust of the discussion of the Gemara is not on Lulav and Esrog at all, but on mitzvahs Shemitah, Shvi'it, which is, of course, a mitzvah that will be upon us very soon. And this gives us a little bit of a way into some of those halachos and an insight into some of the reasons behind them. And as they apply to the lulav and esrog, really this is a bit of a tangential issue. They could apply to other forms of fruit as well. But here we're dealing with a person who needs to buy his arba minim, and it's shmita, and the produce that he would be using for his arba minim, particularly the esrog, as we'll see in a moment, are shmita esrogim. So what does he do? How does he get hold of it? How does he pay for it? Is he allowed to trade in that? Is he allowed to buy it off a merchant, etc., etc.? So this is what the Mishnah is dealing with. So we start the Mishnah. Halokech lulav mechavero. There's a lot of discussion on all of the words here in the Mishnah to try and really define the situation. But let's try and work our way through without too many alternatives. Halokech lulav mechavero. Someone who is buying a lulav from his fellow man. And Rashi explains, and this seems to be fairly clear from the Gemara, we're dealing from a person he's buying it from is an Am Haaretz. An Am Haaretz means a non-learned Jew, someone who you can't be sure is keeping the halachas of Shemitah, maybe even Trumas and Maestros and things like that. But here we're concerned with Shvius, because this is happening on the Shemitah year. And we're not too sure whether the merchant who's selling it to you, we should see later on, it's not really a merchant, but someone who may be selling individual, small numbers, because to actually work in merchandise, a Shemitah crop is forbidden. We're not talking here about when we have Heta Mechira. So we're talking here about stuff which is absolutely Shemitah, someone who's keeping the Shemitah and isn't working the field, but it's popped up. This is the fruit of that year's crop. And it has kedushas shvius. It is sacred, it has sanctity, like Otzer Beis does, if we use the Otzer Beis approach today. There are only certain things you're allowed to do with produce, which is really shmita. So this is an esrog, which is shmita, and he buys it from someone who we are not certain of his religious credentials. So how does he make this purchase? Is he allowed to make a full trade type payment to the person he's paying over? So the Mishnah gives you an eitzah, gives you some advice as to how you can do this, because after all, you need your esrog, unless if you're going to take the year off from your arba minim. So nosen lo esrog b'matana. Really strange. He should ask the seller to allow him to receive the esrog as a gift. The implication here is that he's paying for the lulav, and the lulav isn't going to be subject to the rules of Shemitah. And the Gemara will ask, by the way, very strongly, why not? Why isn't the lulav equally in question? The lulav also grows on a palm tree. Isn't there a Shemitah? So there will be some discussion about that, but that's not for now. Here, at this point, the Gemara is assuming that the lulav is not subject to the rules of Shemitah, even though it's grown on a palm tree. But the esrog is a fruit and is definitely subject to the laws of Shemitah. In such circumstances, there's no difficulty in buying the lulav, but there seems to be some potential barrier to buying the esrog, because essentially you're paying over money for a kedusha dik esrog where you shouldn't really be indulging in any form of trading. We will see later on that that's not so clear, but in fact you can buy and sell individual stuff on a very, very small scale, as long as it's not done in the form of a trading arrangement. In other words, I don't have a stall table, and I don't have if you like, a business card and all this sort of thing. So it could be we're talking here about an individual transaction, and the Gemara is later on going to tell you what's wrong with an individual transaction. If it's just individual, it's possibly mutter. So why does he need to ask for the esrog as a matana? The Gemara will explain later on. However, at this point in the Mishnah, before you know what the Gemara tells you, you should assume that you shouldn't buy an esrog. You should only find an esrog. If someone is opening his field to you because it's Shemitah and everything's hefka, and he puts a big sign up, which very few people do, by the way, a sign up on his fence: you may enter my garden, it's a Shemitah year, and he's got an esrog tree, then you can go in and get an esrog. That's how you should get your esrog. This guy doesn't have such a facility, so he's got to approach someone who's offering him on a street corner an esrog. He has to say to the lulav seller, he has to say, look, I'll buy your lulav but I'm paying 100 shekels for the lulav. Can't you throw in, so to speak, the esrog as a maton? That's the eitzah. And then you're not paying for the esrog. We're assuming at the moment that there isn't a real trick arrangement over here. The Gemara will talk about whether you can make trick arrangements whereby the cost of the esrog is swallowed into an inflated cost of the lulav. At this point, assume that's not even the case. The Mishnah is not even giving you that eitzah. The merchant has said to you that the esrog is 100 shekels and the lulav is the lulav is 100 shekels. Lulav is 100 shekels, and the esrog is 10 shekalim, on the grounds that the esrog is cheaper than the lulav, which itself is mysterious. But that seems to be an implication here. And there he says to the lulav, look, for the 100 shekels I'm giving you, couldn't you just swallow the 10 shekels worth of the esrog and not charge me separately? And he says, okay, that's fine, because you're not then explicitly paying for the esrog. Why shouldn't you do this? Lefi she'ein, says the Mishnah, Rishoy lelokcho bashvis. This is what the Gemara is going to discuss. Because the buyer has no halachic right to buy fruits of shvius. And therefore, it's got to be gifted to him and not bought. That's then not a transaction. That's free for all. That's a very Shmitter-friendly thing to do, because after all, when you make your own field hefker, you're allowing people to go in and take for it. Essentially, you're gifting the produce of your field to people who come in, anyone who does this. And in the same way, you could go to this lulav seller and ask him to gift you an esrog, and that also works fine. So that's the raw Mishnah. Of course, none of us work this way nowadays. First, because we buy their esrogim after the Shemitah from Chutz La'aretz, or we do so it's a based in, and the whole arrangement's different. Here we're looking at, if you like, the raw situation as it might have been before any of the luxuries of the Rabbonei Yerushalayim, etc. So you had to decide what to do. This is the only way you can get an esrog. That's the end of the Mishnah. Okay, now the Gemara asks a question, which is one that probably would have interested most of the population who are reading this Mishnah. Let's say this is the halacha that we're told, go to the lulav seller and tell him to give you a gift. How many, Jewish tradesmen are known to be quite sharp in their practices. How are they going to gift an esrog over in the price of the lulav without inflating the price of the lulav? So that's the first question. The Gemara says, look, we know Jewish merchants, they don't work like that. So lo rotza litain lo b'maton amahu, that's the beginning of the Gemara. If the lulav merchant isn't prepared to deal on these terms and gift the esrog to him, mahu, what is the halacha? In other words, what should he do? How is he going to make do for this year's Arba Minim? So the Gemara answers, Amar Rav Huna. Rav Huna says, and this is an answer which is much more, let's see, recognizable. Mavliya le demei esrog b'lulav. He gets the lulav seller to swallow up the cost of the esrog in the price he pays for the lulav. And I explained to you, I think last week as well, this idea of havlah is something you see sometimes on Shabbos as well, and it works in other spheres of a halacha. Whereas if you don't make something which is not allowed explicit, but you make it implicit in another larger whole, so to speak, you hide it within a bigger bill, then all of a sudden what would have been forbidden on its own becomes permitted as part of that bigger bill. So when you ask your helper to come and do some work for you on a Shabbos, wash some dishes, well, you don't have at all any problem with a housekeeper or a Filipino or someone who's with you all the time, because you're paying them a weekly wage. So when they do work for you on Shabbos, essentially, you're paying them for Shabbos work b'havlah. You're not specifically saying, the Saturday's work you're getting 10 shekels for, Monday you're getting 10, Tuesday you're getting 10, nothing like that. You're paying them an amount. Now it's true that part of that amount, and perhaps even a large amount of the work being delivered, is being done on the Shabbos. But since there was some preparatory work, since there's some side work, and you're paying for it in a havlah arrangement, not explicitly earmarking the amount in relation to Shabbos work, that is mutter. That's called b'havlah. You swallow it up. And we do all sorts of things. I said to you that in a sense, even a chazan and a rabbi get paid for Havlaw. They're getting paid for, maybe it's not a malacha they're doing, but they're being paid for Shabbos. Why are they being paid for Shabbos? Because it's assumed they have to prepare their speeches on the Friday. If they just walked in cold, if you like, that's very interesting. That wouldn't be allowed, imagine. I'm thinking, let someone walks into your shul and the rabbi didn't turn up and you ask him to speak suddenly. And he says, but I need a payment. If you pay him, you might be paying him for Shabbos because he didn't prepare for you before because you never asked him to come in the first place. Now, I don't want to make any halachas out of it, but that could be an implication over here. So the Gemara is suggesting, Rav Huna is saying, if you work by Havlaw, it's not a problem. It does not have to be a matana. If the seller isn't willing to give you a gift, then as long as he doesn't state separately the price of the esrog, that's fine. So really what he should say, I mean, there's all questions in halacha, how he should phrase it, or how you should ask the question, so that it's b'havlaw. Ideally, the seller should say, I'm selling lulavim for 110 shekels. And he always just throws in the esrog. That's b'havlaw, even though really, if he was selling the lulav, it's only would have been 100, and the esrog would be 10, so he's getting the full amount for the esrog. That's b'havlaw. Yeah, so there is some question as to whether it has to be put in a certain way, and how innocent is an arrangement, etc. But b'havlaw works. So that would be fine, as long as you didn't pay explicitly for the esrog, that would be fine. And Rav Huna says this is the way you work in the real world, where the seller isn't prepared to give you something for nothing. But now the Gemara asks the kasha, the leis of lei behedya, why do we even need to work with a trick of Havlaw? The Gemara is asking a first principled kasha. What was wrong? Why was the Mishnah concerned in the first place? In terms of saying you need to have the seller gifted to you. What was the suspicion over here? Where is the issa? Where is the transgression potentially? So you said you can't trade in Shavuos. This is not a case of trading in Shavuos. The Gemara takes for granted that we're not dealing with a wholesaler over here or whatever. We're dealing with a one-to-one small scale purchase, as you'll see a little bit later as we go through the Gemara. And a person is allowed to sell a small quantity and to receive money for it. And if that's the case, let that be explicit. If, as long as you, if you know that this may be a Shavuos esrog, it has kedusha, it doesn't matter. You can take it, you can pay something for it, and that's fine, because you're doing so on a very small scale activity, which means the seller must not be involved as a professional seller. But if you know that's the case, then there is no problem even in declaring a separate price, says the Gemara. And it's strange that the Mishnah doesn't tell us that. The Mishnah says it's got to be a gift. It doesn't have to be a gift. Let him say it's 100 shekel for the lulav and 10 for the esrog. That doesn't matter. As long as he's only selling 1 or 2 esrogim in his back garden, so to speak, that's fine. So why does it even have to be masked in the way the Mishnah suggests? So the Gemara explains why. We don't want to pass any money over explicitly now to the seller, even though you can make individual transactions like this on a small scale. Says the Gemara, because one is not allowed to pass over the money in exchange for Shemitah produce to an Am Ha'aretz. Those are the key words, to an Am Ha'aretz. We're saying that the person sending it to him is not necessarily a reliable person. A person who you know keeps all the nitty-gritty of halacha. Why does that matter? It matters because of a very important principle. And that principle is that even though you can exchange money for goods on a small scale, even if the goods are Shemitah, nevertheless, there's a startling consequence to that exchange. And that is that the money which the seller receives has the din of Shvius as well. It has the din of Shemitah money Get that into your head. Shemitah coins. We'll see what that means in a moment. The way in which the halacha puts it is that Shemitah Paris tofes, or the Demei Paris tofes as a kedusha. They grab the kedusha from the kedusha of the fruit, but they don't substitute for it. Essentially, you now have two kodesh articles. The esrog is kodesh because it was Shemitah. It was a Shemitah fruit. The money that was paid over is deemed to have kedusha shvius as well, because it was paid over for a shvius article, and that's the halacha. So essentially, you've got double trouble now. It's as far as your osrik is concerned, that's fine. We say that's fine. But you've given over this money to an Am Haaretz. Now, if he hadn't been an Am Haaretz, that would not have been a problem. That money would have had kedusha shvius, but we trust that the seller will make use of the money in a way which is compatible with the rules of shvius. That means he would only be allowed to buy food with it, and only food in a small scale. He wouldn't be able to do business with it. It also means, strangely enough, that when the Zaman Bior comes, or whatever it is, at a certain time when you're supposed to destroy anything that's left, which was Shemitah, and that's a complication of Shemitah, you'd have to do something with a coin. Now, you can trust a reliable halacha observing Jew with the money that you pay over, because he knows that the money he's receiving for it have kedusha shvius. But this is an Am Haaretz, and you don't know what he'll do. He's very likely to take the money and to buy, stocks and shares with it, or bullion or Bitcoin or something like that. Now, that's not an allowable use of shvius money. And because we have a suspicion that he may operate that way, you may not pass that money over to the seller, because he may misuse that money. However, if you do so b'havalah or as a matana, that doesn't matter, because we're saying even if you do it b'havalah, in other words, you pay an inflated amount for the lulav, so to speak, to pay for the esrog. Since it's not explicit, the money you pay over, none of the money, not even the 10 shekels and the 110 that you're paying for the package, is deemed to be explicitly for the esrog. So it's not considered to have any Shemitah content at all, the amount that you pay over. But the moment you negotiate separately for them and you earmark 10 shekels, for example, as the cost of the esrog, that becomes Shemitah money, which has certain restrictions. If you give it over to a Am Haaretz, he may well abuse the rights. And so what? You could say it's his bad luck. It's not his bad luck, because you have a responsibility to make sure that everything you do doesn't lead somebody else into an aveira. Before the blind, you shouldn't put a stumbling block, which means, as we understand it, that you shouldn't be in any way contributingly involved in somebody else's aveira. And by passing him over Shemitah money, you may well be giving him the tools of an aveira, because he will then use that money in a way he shouldn't use it. So that's what the Gemara means over here. That's why you need to ask the Am Haaretz to either gift it to you or to arrange, as Rav Huna suggested, a havalah transaction where he doesn't at least explicitly earmark any of the money he's charging against the esrog. That's what the Gemara says over here to explain the Mishnah. The Mishnah is asking you to do something devious, because if you were to pass the money explicitly over as esrog money, then we have a problem as far as what the Am Haaretz is going to do with that money. We don't want to put that money, we don't want to give him ammunition, so to speak, to shoot himself. Okay. And the Gemara now brings you a brisa to prove it, the Tanya, because it was taught in a brisa. Ein mosrin demei perish shvius le'am haaretz, yoser mi mozon shalosh seudos. This is a more detailed brisa that says you shouldn't pass demei perish shvius to an Am Haaretz. You shouldn't, if you like, buy off an Am Haaretz and provide him with a payment for a Shemitah fruit or Shemitah produce. But here, there's a qualification. if the amount you're paying is more than the amount for 3 meals. And we assumed before that the cost of the esrog might have been more than the cost of 3 meals. 3 meals, that's going to be an assumption. What is this saying over here? It's saying that there is a de minimis, even with an am haaretz. If you give him shmita money, which is, if you like, shmita money, I mean, you know, if you give him money in payment for a shmita fruit, as long as it's less than 3 seudos, we don't mind, because we don't believe, we can assume, this is very, very problematic. I don't understand it myself. We can assume that the smaller quantity of money you're paying over to him will be used in a non-transgressive fashion. He will probably use it to buy meals, and that will be all right. But if you were to pay over a sum more than 3 meals, 3 meals here is just some sort of criterion of minima. If you were to pay more, there's a real fear that he's going to buy his bitcoins or he'll do some bigger business with it, right? If you've just got a few small coins, it's pocket money you usually use for fairly, what shall we say, benign reasons or benign purposes. If you give someone a larger wad of money, he's thinking about buying a great big washing machine or something, right? Not a bar of chocolate, but something much bigger. So therefore, up to an amount of money from which you could buy 3 meals is considered to be a transaction you can make with an am haaretz even for a shmita. And we don't need to be worried about that. But anything more than that, a more valuable transaction or more high value transaction is something you can't do with him at all, because we suspect he's going to put that to some sort of commercial deal that he's putting together in the future, some sort of investment for real estate or something. And as I say, it seems that the esrog was deemed to be something worth more than that, more than 3 meals. Otherwise, if it's all within 3 meals, then that's okay according to this pricer anyway. But it's assumed to be more than that, which is interesting in itself, because we wanted to say before that it was a fairly small cost in relation to the lulav. And now all of a sudden, 3 meals, depends where you're having your meals maybe. At those days, it wasn't 3 meals at a flashy Jerusalem restaurant. It might have been 3 small bagels or something like that. That could have been 3 meals. So the de minimis could have been quite small, really. That threshold might be quite small. And you're not allowed to do this. So the Brisa does agree with what we said before. And the Brisa is an early authoritative source and tells us very clearly that you shouldn't be giving demei shavias over to an am haaretz, because we don't know what use he will put the money. So this is the raya. The Brisa goes on to give you a very interesting b'diavad fix if you've made a mistake. V'im mosar, supposing he made a mistake, not always does a halacha tell you what to do when you've made a mistake. How do you dig yourself out of a hole that you've done yourself? So over here, the Brisa is telling you how to dig yourself out of a hole. Suppose I was involved in a transaction with an am haaretz, and I bought some shmita produce off him. And you know, in a fit of forgetfulness, or because I hadn't learned this Mishnah and Lulav HaGozel or whatever it is, I didn't know the halacha immediately, but I shouldn't pass him over more than 3 meals worth of money. So I made a more major transaction with him, and I've broken the rules now. Oh dear! Now there's a real suspicion that the am haaretz is going to use this to buy bitcoins with or something, you know, some extravagant investment. And he will then be breaking a law. And I'll have transgressed on lo sitei niver. I've given him the opportunity to do an avera. Can I extract myself? Yes, there's something I can do. The am haaretz is now out of sight. I don't see him at all. I can't shout for him to come back. And yet there's something I can do to dig myself out of the hole. And I have to play the following trick, right? In Mossad, Yoma, the buyer who realizes now he's paid over the cost of 3 meals to the am haaretz, he has to make a proclamation. He may make a proclamation. And he should say, Hare mo'us halolu, may the coins I have here on the table next to me, yiyu mechulolin al peiros, sheyesh li besoch Basi. May they be alpeiros? No, sorry. Maybe the money, this money be basi. Let the money, the money that means that I've given to the Am Haaretz, let the money that I've given to the Am Haaretz, who is now out of sight, the payment I made him, let their Kedusha be transferred over to fruits which are now in front of me in my house. Abracadabra, everything is healed. What has happened there? A transfer of Kedusha. Now we know there are other situations like this. It's called pidyon, where you essentially make, pidyon means redemption. Yeah, just you have a pidyon haben, right? You have a 30-day-old son who is now holy to the law. You're not allowed to take him home, really. You know, you've got him here in front of the Kohen. You've got to redeem him. What do? You give him a coin and he gives you your son back again. That's pidyon haben. The Kedusha is transferred from the son to the money. The Kohen now has the money. He's been powdered the son on money, and you have your son back again. And that's what's going on at a pidyon haben. I mean, that's a very, it's a very symbolic transaction, but it's very similar to this. There's a din of pidyon maaseh sheni as well. If you've got maaseh sheni, which is stuff you have to bring to Yerushalayim on 5 out of the 7 year of a Shemitah cycle, and you don't want to take it up because it's so much, you haven't got a wheelbarrow big enough, you powder the fruits that you need to take up to eat in Yerushalayim. You powder that fruit on money, and you take the money up to Yerushalayim because it's more portable, isn't it? And then you spend the money in Yerushalayim, and the kedusha of Maaseh Sheni is transferred from the fruits onto the money, and the money is now Maaseh Sheni money, which you have to use to buy fruits and food in Yerushalayim. And what was Maaseh Sheni is now ordinary food that can be eaten in Japan, or not in Japan, obviously, somewhere in Eretz Yisrael, in Haifa or Bnei Barak or whatever it is. So this idea of pidyon is well known. There's another case of pidyon in Hektish, where an animal which you've already made Hektish, that's going to be used as a korban, for example, develops a mum, a blemish, and can't be used anymore. You can be powder it back again. You can also be powder a gift you've given to the Beis Hamikdash. If you gave over something to the Beis Hamikdash, like you gave over, I don't know, a fine chair or goblet to the Beis Hamikdash, which you could do originally, to the treasurer of the Beis Hamikdash, and then you decided you wanted it back again, there's a din of pidyon. You have to pay the money's worth of what you gave over that you want back again, plus a penalty for doing that, if you like, a levy for the transaction, which is called a fifth, chomesh, but which actually means a quarter in one of these wonderful pieces of biblical mathematics. A fifth means a quarter. And if you pay that quarter over in excess of the value of what is with a gizbar of the temple, he will give you back your goblet and he will take the money instead. Pidyon, what's happened is something that had a kedusha, it belonged to the Beis Hamikdash because you gave it over to them, has now been redeemed and is now considered to be your own again. You can sit on it and you can uncover it and cover it, sell it to whatever you want, but the money with the gizbar now has transferred to it and on it the status of Hektish and can be used by the Beis Hamikdash. So all these are well-known principles of pidyon. So says the Brisa over here, you've sent this guy away, this Am Haaretz away, with your Maaseh Sheni, with your Shvius money, your Shemitah money, and it has a Kedusha. And you're worried that he might abuse its Kedusha. But you can do this even in his absence. You can recite the following formula. I've got fruit here in front of me on the table. I wish to back transfer the Kedusha that was on the money that I gave to the Am Haaretz, wherever he is and wherever that money is. I wish to transfer it, action at a distance, something Einstein didn't like very much. I'd like to transfer it onto the fruits I have. What does that mean? Then when he's done that, abracadabra, the money that the Am Haaretz has is now fully chulin. It's not demei shavias anymore. But the fruit that the buyer has on his table become kedushas shavias. And he has to, because before they were ordinary fruits, let's say, there were fruits that were not shavias, but he's transferred the kedusha. It's literally a transfer. It's not that both now have the kedusha. No, he can do this pidyon, which substitutes the kedusha that was on the money onto his own fruit. He has to treat his fruit now that wasn't before Shemitah as if it is Shemitah. And the money that the Amoritz has is now fine. There's no possible sin, Aveira, that the Amoritz can do with it because its Kedusha has been transferred from it. So this is the Eitzah. It's a wonderful thing what you can do in halacha sometimes. Again, you can see that the halachic process shows that there's a lot of room here for mental work. Yeah, I talked before about having a negative kavanah, right? In your mind, even if you do an action which seems to be a mitzvah, if in your mind it isn't a mitzvah, it subtracts, the action becomes nullified. You know, it's not considered to be a mitzvah. Over here, even more far-fetched, someone is 1,000 miles away, and you can essentially transfer over Kedusha, so, you know, essentially in a one fell swoop to something you have in front of you. There are some different, similar situations with Hefka. You could make something somewhere else Hefka, even though you are actually a long way away. So you can do certain things at a distance in halacha, which you can't really do, you know, under the laws of nature. However, as Tosfos points out over here, there's a bit of a problem because there's actually a machlokas on this. This is not the normal situation of transferring Kedusha that I mentioned to you before. The normal situation when you're transferring Kedusha, shall we say from an animal onto a coin or from fruit onto a coin, Maaseh Sheni, is when both of those are in front of you at the same time. Right? So you've got the large amount of fruit in your storehouse. You've got to take it up to Yerushalayim, but it's too heavy. So you opoder it, you transfer the Kedusha onto money. How do you do that? Normally, you walk into your barn where the fruit is, you walk in with your coins or your 500 shekel notes or whatever it is, and you transfer, you make a statement to transfer the Kedusha's Maaseh Sheni, from the fruits onto the money. And they're both in front of you. And that sounds as though it's a very logical, well, not logical, but judging by halacha, it's something one can understand with some level of reason. However, over here, he's trying to transfer the Kedusha at a distance. He does not have the Demei Shavias. He doesn't have the money he passed over to the Amoritz. That Amoritz is nowhere near him. He could be on a different continent. And he's making this statement at a distance to transfer the Kedusha, which is in someone else's possession a long way away, onto his own fruit. According to many opinions, that does not work. So what's this Eitz and the Brisa here for? It works according to some opinions, but not according to others. So the Rishonim, Tosfos here in particular, raises this as a bit of a question. And he says, look, this may work according to some opinions, this ruse of mentally transferring the Kedusha over at a distance, but it doesn't work according to other opinions. So does this Brisa really only operate according to one opinion and not the other opinions? So Tosfos comes up over here with a very interesting alternative interpretation of this Brisa. And he says, you know what? Maybe this doesn't work at all. It actually doesn't work at all. This transfer of Kedusha at a distance from wherever the Amoritz is holding the coin onto your fruit doesn't work. Well, if it doesn't work, what's the Brisa saying? Do you know what the Brisa is saying? Not that the Kedusha is removed from the coins of the person who you bought it from and is transferred onto your fruit. That doesn't happen. It fails to happen because you don't have both of those commodities in front of you at the same time. But when the Brisa says that this is what you should do to dig yourself out of the hole, it is essentially imposing a penalty on you. And it's really saying, you know what? This is not salvageable. You can't dig yourself out of this hole fully. As far as this Amoritz is concerned, he's holding this money, and the money is too far away for you to be able to do any abracadabra exchange on it. So therefore, the money he holds does have Kedusha, and there's a real risk that he will expend it wrongly and do an Aveira, and it's out of your hands, and you should hang your head in shame. However, we don't let you get away without paying a parking ticket. Just because you seem to have done something wrong, you don't just say for fun, now let's go on to the next. Let's go on to the next Masechta. You have to pay a price. So they impose a knas, like a fine. And they said, you know what? Because you have given over money which has Kedusha's Shemitah on it, and this guy, this Amoritz, may now be wrongly expending it, we're going to impose a fine on some of your own property. And some of your property before that was not Shemitah, some fruits you had before that was not Shemitah, we are going to ask you to treat as if it were Shemitah, which reduces, if you like, the value of that fruit somehow, because you can't transact in it anymore. You have to make sure it doesn't go to waste. You have to eat. There are all sorts of restrictions on Shemitah fruits if you're actually buying Shemitah, like oats of Asif. So this was a fine, very, very different approach, says Tosfos. This exchange at a distance doesn't work according to most people. So let's reinterpret what this Bryce is telling you to do over here as an Eitzah. The Bryce is merely saying that what you should do is to self-impose a fine in order that you, in a sense, to assuage your guilty conscience. You should be going around with a real guilty conscience. So, what do you normally do when you've done something you think is a bit wrong? I've done something a bit wrong, but I'd rather not gain by what I've done. What do you normally do? You might take some money and give it to the stocker. Why do you keep, what's one got to do with the other? You did an avera somewhere now. You think you could bribe a Kodesh Baruch Hu? That's not what you're doing when you do the right thing when you give it to the stocker. In a sense, you assuage your guilty conscience. You say, I deserve to lose some of my money for what I've done. And you give to tzedakah and you feel better afterwards. In the same way, the Bryce is saying, how are you going to feel better after passing this money over to an Amoritz who may well use it incorrectly? And you were, after all, this is contributory negligence on your part that gave him the money. You gave him money you shouldn't have given. So this is what you should do. Some of your existing fruits need to be earmarked as Kedusha. So in a sense, this has a semblance as if you transfer to Kedusha over, but it limits the value you can put on to those fruits. And you'll learn better next time, because every time you have to pay a penalty, you're more careful about exposing yourself to the same risks again. Very interesting view of Tosfos over here, how we read it. And it all rotates around the question of whether you can be poder at a distance. If you don't actually have both the money and the fruits in front of you at the same time, does that pigeon work? So according to many pigeons, it doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, this Bryce is referring to a penalty rather than a true and genuine transfer of Kedusha. Okay, and actually we should turn over to Lamed Tes Amud Beis. I think I gave you 39b as well. But the last few words here are just essentially what I said to you without turning the page. And then the buyer should eat the fruit on which he made this transfer with Kedusha Shvius. And as Tosfos would say, not that they're really Shvius, because the transfer never really worked, but as if they were Kedusha Shvius. You pretended Shvius. You've actually created an unusual, this is a very unusual game, typically a Jewish idea, that you now have fruit in front of you, according to Tosfos, which is not Shemitah fruit, but has to be treated as though it were Shemitah fruit. It's a status which is a self-imposed status of Shemitah fruit, right? Very interesting. Which means you have to stop other people getting hold of it as well, and maybe it means that you have to share it with people and all sorts of wonderful things. Okay. Now the Gemara says, "Bamer Devarim Amurim." This is all part, I think, of the Brisa, in fact, continuation. The Brisa said that as long as it is less than 3 meals worth, you can actually do a transaction with the Amhoritz, and you don't need to worry about him misspending it. Why? Because we assume he will just use it to buy meals with, which is quite within what a person's allowed to do. with Demei Shvius. However, it was more than 3 meals worth. That's when you need this ruse. You have to make this trick about being, whether it works or not, transferring the Kedusha from the money you've given him to your own fruit. But if it's less, it doesn't matter at all. That's what the Brisa says. If it's less than 3 meals worth, we don't mind what the non-Jew, what the Amhoritz does with it. In fact, we suspect that he will do the right thing with it because it's such a small triple amount. Says the Brisa, when do we say that if it's less than 3 meals worth, it's okay to transact and one doesn't have to worry about what the Amhoritz does with the money? Belokeach min hamufka, aval belokeach min hamishuma, afilu bekachatzi issa asur, says the Gemara. It only works, it's only allowed if you know that the Amhoritz got this fruit originally from a field that was hefka through the dinim of Shvius, which it should be with the dinim of Shvius. But if you're aware that he got the fruit from a source which was not hefka for Shvius, in other words, it was a closed up and fenced in field, and it wasn't available to everybody else, which he shouldn't have done. If you're aware that he did do that, then you can't even transact for 3 meals, because this Amhoritz becomes so debased by dealing in his dealings in Shemitah that we don't even want to give him less than 3 meals worth. What are we talking about over here in terms of mufka and mishuma? I mean, this is another, if you like, aspect of Shemitah. In theory, in the original biblical world, before Heter Mechir and all those things, and even today, for those few fields, well, not so few, quite a lot, that actually deal with their land as if the original Shemitah rules applied in full force, and they only do minimum maintenance, they don't sell, and they actually allow people to come in and pluck fruits and pluck food from their fields. That was the original situation, because a person should make their fields hefka. That's the whole point about it, so that the ani and anybody else can come in. Non-transactable, but available, not just for him. I mean, if he's just closed in his own field during Shemitah, then he himself has not followed the rules of Shemitah properly. And of course, if he's closed up and fenced in his field, then he means people not to enter his field. He himself is then violating the halachos of Shemitah by not opening up his field to public land, which is what he should do. So he should open up his lands publicly so people can go in and out. That's called mufka. And that's where we hope the Amhoritz has taken the esrog from, that he's taken the esrogim from an opened field where he was allowed to go in, and it has kedusha shvius. If we know that's where he's taken his esrogim from, then you can transact up to 3 meals worth. The day minimus will allow. But if you know that in fact what he's been doing is he's perhaps gone to the owner of a field which is closed up, and that owner has not made the field available to other people, and he's just transacted individually with him, and he has gone in, and then he's trying to sell that, then it's not a proper Shemitah operating field. We don't want to deal with this Amhoritz at all on Shemitah, and we don't even want to give him 3 meals worth of money. That's what the Gemara is saying over here. So the Gemara is essentially differentiating between 2 types of Amhoritz. Elsewhere, you'll find there are many criteria of an Amhoritz, from the simplest version to the very sophisticated halachic definition of an Amhoritz. But dealing with an Amhoritz sometimes depends upon what level of Amhoritz it really is. It's quite funny over here. Is he a real Amhoritz, or just perhaps a middle type Amhoritz? So what extreme is he? So if it's an Amhoritz to the extent that he may even violate the laws of Shemitah to the extent of going into a field which wasn't made hefka for Shemitah, we don't want to give him the time of day. We don't even want to give him 3 meals. But if he's an Amoritz, in other words, you can't be 100% sure that he's doing all the right things. But the very basic stuff he does, and he only gets his produce from a field which is open to all, which is the way he should be getting his produce at all on a Shemitah year. If he's allowed in, let's say he hasn't got his own open field, if he's allowed in somewhere, then he goes in. And if he's allowed somewhere else, he goes in somewhere else, because they are mufkarim, they're made hefka. If that's what he's doing, then you can buy individually, and you can buy up to 3 meals worth. But you shouldn't buy in big, great quantities, because you shouldn't even trade, even where that's done within a mufkar environment. In other words, the fruit was derived from hefka, there still shouldn't be major trading. But on a one-to-one basis, that would be all right. But if a person has sourced his material and his fruits from something that is not mufka, but is mushma, it is guarded, it is closed in, it is fenced in, then that already puts him beyond the pale, and we don't want even to give him 3 meals worth. We'll stop over here. I'm going to do next time, I'm going to do a skipping to the next Mishnah, because the Gemara of the next daf also, just to let you know, is very, very deep into, one second, very, very deep